Behavioral Health Association, Maryland.
Chad Perman, Department of Health, Population Health.
Andy Udom, Cost Review Commission.
So Donna is going to be joining at 11 for the readmission discussion. Who do we have on the line?
This is Barbara. I'm en route from another meeting.
Thanks, Barbara.
This is Thelma Baker, VHQC.
Ed Baranik, Johns Hopkins.
Diane is on from HSCRC.
Oh, Diane, thanks for calling in. As you can see, Diane can barely talk, but we are hoping that we will try to fill her place on the PPC discussions, but we may need to catch up with her after the meeting. So we have a very packed agenda. As you can see, we're going to start with the impact discussions. And then we put the consumer dashboard discussion. We've been discussing that with some of the consumer representatives. We wanted to give you an update on that and get your feedback on what measures we would like to put on the consumer dashboard. And then in the last hour, we are going to talk about the readmissions program. So with that, we'll turn to the first handout that we have, the PPC description. So just to give an update for some of you who weren't here in the last meeting, we engaged Mathematica to look at the PPC measures, and they did statistical analysis to look at the validity and reliability of the measure. So this is looking at the variation within hospital and between hospitals and see if the measure is really a strong measure from the statistical sense. Their analysis in general produced good results. Majority of the PPCs seem to have a good statistical characteristics, so they are measuring what we think they are measuring. But there were a few that came out as not reliable because of the jumpiness of the measure or because that they didn't predict the next year, so there wasn't a strong correlation in some of those measures. Then from the clinical perspective, what we heard is that we have 65 measures in the program, and the providers would like to have a focused list that they could make an impact and not worry about a few PPCs that have no significant impact to the patient care, but still in the program, and they have to track it. So those are the two kind of reasons why we went back to the PPC list and trying to figure out what we do with the priority list, also the PPCs that seem to be having issues from the statistical perspective. What we kind of try to do is either combine, some of the PPCs are related to each other from the clinical perspective. So one of the issues we think could be that the coding may impact one of the two PPCs. So we say rather than excluding it, does it make sense to combine them? But still, there are, at the end of the day, these are safety measures. It impacts the clinical care. So that's one strategy. And the other strategy is if the measure really looks unreliable and from the clinical perspective it has concerns for the coding and documentation, would we exclude that PPC from the program for this year? What we have in front of you is the list of all the PPCs and what we are recommending based on the input that we have. I think after we publish this, Barbara Epke, thank you, Barbara, for the very thorough analysis. She sent us the list from the Sinai addressing some of the issues around combining versus excluding, and I don't think we reflected those in this document. Diane, could you confirm that? You're shaking your head.
No, I did put it in the most current. It should be in there in the far right.
Oh, okay, Lethbridge, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, right. Additional comments. But the HSCRC recommendation, we didn't take those into account.
Yes, we did. I updated those as well.
Oh, okay. Perfect. So the first page, we don't have any changes from the last year. Before we go in, the one change we are proposing is last year we have 3 tiers on the PPCs. The first one was weighted 100%. The second has 9 PPCs weighted at 60%, and the third had about 20 PPCs, and it weighted much less than the other one. For simplicity purposes, we want to just have 2 tiers, high priority list and the second tier, and then weigh them 100% and 50%. So that we still focus on the high priority list. So with that, in the first page, you see that we don't have any changes that we are recommending. So we'll switch to the second page, and you see that the PPC 16 is the one that we had a discussion about it. First, we were thinking about combining with 15, but based on the clinical comments, it looks like that we would like to keep it as separate and exclude PPC 15. Any discussion on that from? I'm just going to go through. Please stop me if you have any question or not. The second one is the PPC 27. So here, MHA has been also working on trying to think about this priority list. And this is the PPC that MHA recommended to move to Tier 1. And statistically, it seems like a stable and reliable measure, so we are moving that to Tier 1. The next change is in the next page on PPC 38. So here is the one that there is the issue with the statistical reliability and stability versus the clinical importance. I guess the other notice here is when we did we provided you the modeling, whether we drop them or exclude them have very minimum impact on the composite score at the end. So this is about the clinical considerations and trying to get the quality improvement in a meaningful way. You know, at the end of the day, the modeling didn't produce any differences in the PPC scores for the hospitals. So 38, we think we should keep it in Tier 1 because this is a very significant PPC. And also 3M is agreeing that they are saying this shouldn't be dropped, even though statistically there is a variation in this measure. And the reason is probably because we have only 33 cases statewide, and I don't, you know, and we have a list of never events, so this is almost like the never events look like with the 33 measures. So we would like to keep that in the Tier 1, even though statistics are not there. The 41 post-operative hemorrhage and hematoma, this is again MHA recommending to move to Tier 1. The 42 and 49, they were still in Tier 1. So I'm going to the next page. Here is the one is the PPC2 extreme CNS complications. So this came as one of the like a candidate for combination. 3M's recommendation is not to combine it because this is also not, you know, not clinically combinable with the other one. So we would keep it separate but keep it in Tier 2.
Sorry, on that one in particular, it has a low number of observed. It's kind of a general complication. It doesn't have high, I don't remember if it's reliability or validity, but is there any reason not to just drop it?
So it's 77 cases there. I can take a look at the measure.
Can I just say, 3M's concern about this one is that it constitutes a sentinel event, and if there are case examples from the field where we should argue that point, then we could look at those, we could consider those, but based on that input from 3M is why we would like to keep it in Tier 2 rather than dropping.
Right. I get that, and I get that for the things that are serious reportable events, and I'm not going to fall on my sword over this, but just the point that there are other complications that are more typical serious reportable events or have national correlates, and if we really want to try to pare the list down, make it more meaningful, then I would suggest that this one would be one that could go.
The Ppc 15, I'm in the next page. So this one we are, statistically it wasn't reliable and stable, but 3M said that, you know, this shouldn't be dropped because it's a serious complication, Ppc 15, peripheral vascular complication except venous thrombosis. I think LifeBridge is also recommending that we drop this Ppc 15.
I think the main argument around this one was it was generally a clotted fistula, like that's like that's used for dialysis. That's inserted in the patient, and it's easily resolved, if I remember correctly. And I think that 3M disagrees with that assessment clearly. So. As Shule said, they don't, both this and the other one don't make any real difference in scoring, and so we can decide what to do still based on input to either drop or keep in Tier 2.
This is Pat from University. Again, I think if we could relate this to patient harm, I think we would be all in agreement, but I think the reality is many of these are not related to patient harm. It is a clotting issue that is resolved without patient adverse effects.
The Ppc 17. So this one, this one has low reliability and stability, and we wanted to combine this with 17, 18, and 20. This is major gastrointestinal complications without transfusion. Then we have 18 with transfusion, and the 20 is the other gastro. So we are trying to combine all the gastro complications into one. Obviously, from the clinical perspective, it may have significance which one of those, but from the measurement perspective, as a score, we could have one score for all these three PPCs together. But the hospitals would still see which complication it is in their data to be able to work on it. It looks like 19. We have no change proposed. The 24 was suspended because of, so we have another work group with MHA's initiative to looking at the clinical definitions of PPCs. And what came out from that discussion was the 24 coding clinically wasn't reliable, and 3M agreed to suspend that until they changed the definition with the ICD-10. So if they revise the measure and get more reliability on the renal failure, then you know, it may come back to the measurement, but it's going to be suspended until further change. Then the 25 is currently combined with 67.
Currently combined with all of these in PPC 6. It's combined with 26, 43, 63, 60. It's one of the combinations from last year.
So there's no change on that one. 26 is also combined, and so then the 29 is the one that we are also combining with. Are we combining this? No, it seems like with
with 30.
29 and 30, and keeping it in tier 2.
And I think that's another one that in these that are in low reliability or validity don't have a lot of volume. It just doesn't seem to make sense to keep them in the program.
Well, in addition, they don't. In addition, they're not so related. They're not very related to each other.
They are not related to each other. So, sorry, Albert has issues with the microphone, but he said they are not related clinically to each other.
They're really not.
So 33, we propose to combine with 34.
Going back to that, though, so we're suggesting removing of 29, but 30 would stay despite the low stability in tier 2, correct?
30 didn't have an issue noted here.
It has.
It has.
At least on this chart, it was marked as. It wasn't the reliability; it was the stability.
Oh,
but
stability.
And it had 0 cases. I was just asking.
Yeah, so that's also removed then. If you're removing 29, this is also dropping.
I'm just asking.
Yep. 33 combined with 34. So I guess, like Britt said, we want to look at the scoring impact. So there is no scoring impact between the two. So from the clinical perspective, one of them is not reliable, so cellulitis. But then at the end, we have 195 cases in this one. So we are proposing to combine 33 and 34.
Sheila, for those of us that aren't as clinically informed about some of these things, when 3M says it's a sentinel event, can you explain that and also the rationale for why they recommend keeping these sentinel events in? And also, is it a possibility that they could participate in these discussions just so there's an opportunity to kind of have a Q&A and a discussion back and forth with the folks from 3M? Because they obviously know the PPCs quite well, but don't always, aren't definitive necessarily about whether things should be included or not. They have their own interests that they represent.
Right. So then I can talk about the sentinel event issue, but we send this list to 3M and we put their recommendations here. And I think in general, 3M, they have major issues with our statistical analysis. They didn't, from their perspective, these are clinical measures and they are not really formed based on their statistical characteristics. So with that in mind, they are also very cautious about suspending some of these because they think they are all kind of measuring to this bigger picture. So from that perspective, I think they didn't agree with any, I believe they didn't agree with any of the recommendations that we put in terms of dropping or combining. Yet we know that, once they have those 63 measures, then they have one measure that's all other complications. So they do have combined PPC in the measure. It's just they are thinking that the rest is already very well defined and they should be measured separately. Diane, do you want to talk about the Sentinel issue?
Yes, it's generally an occurrence that may cause a death or a severe injury. That is that one should take, therefore one should take notice of it. It could cause a very significant event. So that is what they're referring to as sentinel.
So we did do mortality correlations And there are only a handful of the PPCs that are associated with mortality. So, we would want to keep those in the program from that perspective. But the rest, the vascular example, the clots, it may be a process improvement needed for it, but it may not have significant implications for the patient. Barbara, you look like you're going to say something. No, I'm sorry. Not yet.
So Sheila, I think in 33 and 34, they're really two separate things. So 33 is really more cellulitis. Yeah. 34 is more deeper infections like arthritis, or abscess in the joint, and so forth. I'm not sure how preventable those are, but certainly clinically those are. If there is a preventability aspect, they would be separate, I would imagine, between cellulitis and some of those joint infections and so forth, if you look at the codes. Also in this 15, when I look at the codes, I thought maybe I was not looking at the right place, but it has a lot of other things than just clotting. It has gangrene of the upper extremity, emboli, and so forth. So I don't think it's just the clot issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was kind of percolating some of my thought, and it's just to me, two very different levels of severity potentially. So I think they should be separate as well. Okay.
And one more point about these GI complications. So I think 18 and 19 are sort of more GI hemorrhage type of complications, and the 20 are really non-hemorrhagic, other GI issues. So again, I would say that potentially 18, 19 could be combined.
You mean 17, 18?
17, 18.
And then drop 20.
Well, yeah, either drop 20 or keep it separate. Probably drop because it's got like.
Saeed, what is your thought about the poisoning PPCs? To me, while the statistics aren't there necessarily, they really are. One should not be poisoned.
This is Pat. I'd like to. I totally agree with Diane. I think the question is this program. So any sentinel event in healthcare should be prevented. No one's arguing that whatsoever. I think the question is what complications are we targeting that clinically we have the opportunity to improve? So I think there's just a differentiation in the sense of what this program is intended for.
Yes, I think in addition, once you start including what would be a major sentinel event, then there is the issue of how many do you include? What do you include? It's a whole other arena in my mind. Rather than improving care, preventing a never event is a different issue, and I agree with Pat.
And just these pairs where there is the only differentiation is whether a transfusion was given or not. I think, and that issue was raised in one of those paired PPCs. It's very hard to know the temporal relationship of the transfusion from the methodology that's used here. So the transfusion is always assumed was a result of whatever, because all they're trying to separate is whether it was the underlying problem is the same. The only difference is whether a transfusion was given, thus perhaps it was more severe as opposed to less severe. But that assumption implies that every transfusion that would be given would be after the event, which is not clear from the coded data that's used. And the other issue is that if you look at that transfusion list, it lists virtually every transfusion, including giving immunoglobulins, which is irrelevant if you're trying to find the distinction between when a transfusion is given for a hemorrhagic complication versus perhaps given for, whatever reason, because even albumin infusion and immunoglobulin infusions are included in that list of transfusions that qualify for that distinction. So I think to get around all of this, combining them would make sense, where the only distinction is between whether a transfusion was given or not.
And Bob, to your 3M question, originally when we did the PPC, if you remember, we added all the PPCs together. We weren't really measuring a PPC rate in the scoring. We were measuring the cases weighted by the cost. So in that case, whether you have these small cases in the measure really didn't have that much of an impact. Now that we changed to our PPC rate, that we are measuring PPC rate for each PPCs, I think that elevated some of these issues around the relationship of each PPC with other and the coding issues. And I think 3M was concerned from the beginning about that approach of measuring PPC rates. They advised us to create a pool of the PPCs rather than measuring a PPC rate. All right, so going down the list, I guess the 44, let me see if I didn't miss any page, sorry. Yep. So 44 is the one that wasn't reliable, but the 3M disagreed with dropping it, and we are proposing to keep it in Tier 2. And then the obstetrical ones. So in general, obstetrical PPCs were originally excluded, and we put them in as we start measuring the PPC rates. And again, here is the transfusion with and without transfusion. That seems to be having an issue with the coding. So we are proposing to combine the obstetrical PPCs for, hemorrhage into 1, lacerations into 2, and then keep the under 59, 60, 61, 62 as a combined measure. So that way we deal with that transfusion question, but still have the OB-related PPCs as a combined PPC. So
So the only problem with combining sort of anesthetic complications and infectious complications is it doesn't seem like the preventive measures are at all similar.
Right.
Just to clarify, so you were saying you would combine the hemorrhage in one, the lacerations in another, and then the infections in a third. So it's just you're combining the obstetrical hemorrhage with and without transfusion as one.
As one.
But not all of them together.
That's right. That's what what we heard from the clinical folks, that it didn't make sense to combine laceration and the hemorrhage into one, but combining within each group made sense.
Because at the end of the day, the goal of this is to help us concentrate on the areas that there are opportunities and share best practices, right?
Right. But what I heard Albert saying is that for the 59, so that's the anesthesia, 60 is infections, 61 other, and 62 other. So you're saying that it may not make sense to combine all those together, and we may need to just keep them separate.
Well, there's one approach where we would stratify the reporting, but from a measurement and scoring perspective, combine sort of this obstetric bundle, if you will. Not to say that the interventions are exactly the same for each type of obstetric complication, but we would have the opportunity for stratification and reporting. It was a compromise, frankly, that we were, based on what the industry was suggesting, that we were considering we might implement. But if there's strong concern about it, we can open the discussion.
So when we, I have different reactions to thinking about scoring, depending what we mean by scoring, and what we mean by, opportunities for improvement. Whenever I think of scoring, I think, is it fair to score people based on this? And I would almost always say, if it's not a good measure, if it's not reliable in particular, then I don't think we should score anyone on anything that is, unreliable. So, because if it's not reliable, it can't be valid. And if it's not valid, it's not fair. So I think that that's something that we need to clarify.
So, right, so the 60, for example, is not a reliable measure. But so in that case, we may drop the 60, but in the bleeding examples, when we combine them, then the measure becomes reliable. Then the issue there for us was, is it about the transfusion question that some hospitals are not reporting or documenting accurately, was it about the nature of that PPC? When you combine them together, they became reliable. So in that sense, we feel comfortable combining the PPCs, because then it becomes a reliable measure, and we are still not losing the that important complication. What we've seen in the past is, if it is that distinction, transfusion or not, from the documentation and coding perspective, there is a very fine line sometimes that if you're not counting the PPC without transfusion, that fine line could be stretched so that we see a different measure in the PPC with transfusion. But we'll take that into account, and I think from that perspective, PPC 60 is the only one then we would be dropping and keeping the others separately.
Yeah, the other point about bundling the obstetric ones are that not all hospitals are birthing hospitals, so there was I think sort of an issue about wanting to dilute a little bit the from a scoring perspective, the sum of the obstetric PPCs, because there were more than a dozen hospitals that don't do births, so they're potentially advantaged in some way if these PPCs don't count at all. So there was another strategy about the bundling.
So then if we'll send you a cleaned up version based on your comments, but at the end, I think a few PPCs we are dropping and a few PPCs we are combining based on your input. And
we say suspend.
Sorry. Could I just check with the PPC 44 and 45? Mm-hmm. Those were two that Mathematica had flagged. And again, they're kind of general. Well, the 44 is general, other surgical complications. 45 is the post-procedure foreign bodies. And we would recommend dropping suspending those.
So this is again 44 and
45.
45. I mean, again, this is the kind of the never event issue to me, right? The post-procedure foreign bodies. I mean, that is, I think if anything, I would suggest if that's the case, maybe we'll see if this could be a never event. 18 cases, and on a rate basis, it may not be reliable, but if you put it as a never event, then, these 18 cases as a case will become important.
So what does that mean as far as the policy goes if you make it a never event? This is post-procedure foreign bodies is one of those occurrences that hospitals have on their, I don't know if you remember a few years back that we had a policy about serious events and harm that occurred to a person. So if there was a list, and I can't tell you what all of them are, but I'm sure this one is on there. If a serious harm occurs to a person, then the hospital doesn't submit a bill for that. They wouldn't do that to the person anyway, but it goes through a whole risk management process. So it's things like this are elevated to a serious look within the hospital. So again, to a point that was made on one of the complications earlier, this is a serious thing, just like poisoning from anesthesia. You don't want it to happen, but it may not be appropriate to have it in this kind of a methodology.
But so this is, if it is a never event in our program, then for hospital to get 10 score, that they should have 0 event. If they get 1 event, regardless of what the patient mix is, then they're going to get 0. And in my mind, yes, there is a separate place. The serious reportable events are set, but in terms of the payment adjustments, this is an additional adjustment on the quality of care, so I don't know why you would want to exclude these never events. I can see in a scenario, just for simplicity, if they were correlated, right? On the one hand, if the hospital has a lot of these events, they are doing stuff on the never event policy, yet we may give them positive adjustments on our scoring if we don't include them in the performance measurement.
I think the other big concern with these ones that have such low volumes, low expected rates, and with the zeros, is that if one occurs, your score on that PPC goes up to or goes down to a 0. So the scores are either a 0 or a 10.
Right.
And complications like this are very volume dependent. So these are the kinds of complications in particular that really tend to happen if they harm the larger hospitals. And the smaller hospitals are getting zeros on these. And if you look at the ranking at the end of the year, it's a lot of smaller hospitals at the very top. And not to say that they don't have good quality, because that's not what I'm saying, but to say that it's some of these complications that have these very low expected rates that are skewing those results.
And that's a different question to me, 45. To me, whether I understand the math, if you have more patients, more chances of doing, I guess, wrong here, but at the end of the day, this is such a significant PPC. Regardless of your size, you should have 0 events on this one.
Yeah, and I this is Pat again, and I agree that it's a significant event. I guess I go back and ask the group the question about what is this program intended to drive, because in all honesty, having this here doesn't change practice. It doesn't make it better, because believe me, we're trying to have all kinds of processes in place to avoid leaving any foreign body in the body. So this really isn't improving our care related to that. Our care related to that is being improved because it is a sentinel event and it is very serious. So to me, it just goes back to what is this program intended to drive, and sentinel events really are, I think from a clinical perspective, or never events, I should say, are in a category of in its own, in the sense of our intent to avoid at all costs.
Okay.
Also, I mean, wasn't this, along with some of the other sentinel events, part of what CMS has been focusing on and targeting? So I'm just wondering, from the standpoint, if we're dropping some of these relative to what CMS has emphasized, isn't that sort of a negative in terms of our perception of what we're? I think in general, these types of things should be on the list. I think you can make the argument that you made about any of the ones that have small numbers, but the fact that there's focus on it, and it's a broad focus, and it's part of a scoring methodology, I think adds weight to what we're trying to achieve, whether it makes a difference in any one PPC or not, just in terms of what the hospitals do. But it shows that it's important, and Medicare thinks it's important. It was originally, I believe. So it's not part of the Foreign body is not part of
the hacks.
Again, I think, I think there's a difference, but we're all in agreement that these should never happen, and they're of the highest priority. It's just a question of, does it belong here?
And I would say, yeah, Dr. Bott?
I was just going to say, CMS has two separate programs around that. One is the traditional hack that is scored separately, but the other one is where they actually reduce the weight of the DRG and basically don't give you any credit for treating a complication that should have never happened. So in other words, the DRG is not weighted heavier in those paired DRGs where there is a serious complication. So that's a different program. So I guess the issue is for these types of events that are so uncommon, if you will. I guess Stacey's point is that perhaps there should be some other method of, like CMS treats this group totally separately, not put it into the value-based purchasing calculation. And they do it through the DRG sort of weighting methodology. And so the question is, should there be some linkage of these to payment, and is it possible to find a way to do that linkage without perhaps having the unintended consequence of the methodology affecting some people differently? So that might be one of the things to kind of look at to see if these could be sort of linked to payment in a different way, because they may be different.
So in other states, does Medicare not pay for them?
So if you have a DRG and you have one of these things, you will not get credit for that in increasing the weight of the DRG. So you basically are not paid for it.
And that goes along with that. That goes back to a few years ago when we voluntarily did this policy that, that serious events like this, hospitals don't charge for that. So we're not getting paid for that.
Right, and I think what this is doing is we are actually penalizing you. So one thing is you're losing that revenue from those cases, but if you put it in this program, there is a penalty, additional penalty associated with those, and given these are serious events, I do think that it is appropriate given what we are doing. Any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say that gets back to what's the intent of this program. Is the intent of this program to penalize hospitals when there's a mistake, or is the intent of this program to improve patient care? If the intent is to improve patient care, which I believe it is, then if we already have systems and functions in place to address those never events, and I don't think the penalty here is going to make any change in those systems that are to prevent never events, then I'm not sure why we would include it. If we're looking just for a way to penalize somebody, then include everything you can that could be a penalty. But I don't think that's anybody's desire. I think it's our desire that everybody would reap the total amount of reward possible in all of these categories, that there would be no penalties, because that would mean we're hitting the numbers the way we should be. So
right.
I think from that perspective, if this program is to improve care, then it should be addressing those areas where there's not already a fully functioning, really good, strong program around those individual items that are the never events.
Right. So if you get 10 scores, you get additional, as you know, it's not a penalty program. It is a reward program too. So if you don't have any of these never events, you get additional reward for it. So I think it goes both ways. And when you look at the year-to-date one, you'll see it's not a penalty program.
I mean, I guess it would be worth trying to see if that's the case. I think that if it's not working, then this program will encourage small hospitals to do fewer things, to have fewer lines of business. For example, don't deliver babies, drop your OB program, because if you do a lot, you're only because there are likely to be some problems sometime. Why do it? Just leave it to the big hospitals. They will get penalized for things because they are big, and they're very likely to have sooner or later have some problem. So they can get the penalties. They won't get the benefits, and you won't be worried about being penalized yourself. So in a way, something that might be worth doing would be to look to see what the effects are of the program, perhaps on bigger and smaller hospitals and specific lines of business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think on the OB case, when you look at it, it's not about the PPC program that some hospitals drop their OB services. I think in terms of the scoring, it's proportion to what they have. We are working on small versus large hospitals. It's a larger issue. Seems like it's not about which PPCs we have. It's about the seems like they are service lines, but we haven't been able to confirm what's going on there.
So just a point of clarification, with our model agreement with CMS, we have, committed to reducing PPCs by 30% right, over the 5 years. And in that it says, 65 PPCs. How much flexibility do we really have to reduce the scope of a program if we talk about, we want to throw out, 20 measures because they don't quite fit what we think we should be doing? Has CMS really said, we have that much flexibility?
So I think for PPC 24, since 3M was agreeing to suspend it, I think we, stopped reporting it to CMMI, and we haven't had too much pushback on that. I think for these, we might consider that we still would be reporting them and monitoring them, that we wouldn't be telling, because especially given that 3M disagrees with removing some of them, I think we would still be reporting them, and if we saw, issues with them, we would be making sure hospitals were aware of what was going on.
Not only reporting, it is part of the target. I don't think CMS is going to. When we did the agreement, it was 65 PPCs. What we do on our MHAC program, we have flexibility, but in terms of our target, it's the 65 PPCs. So it's a very good point, Chad, that no matter what we do here, we are still accountable for all these PPCs from our contractual perspective.
So we're still accountable for the 65 PPCs to them. The MHAC is sort of a parallel arrangement.
Right. So this is how we implement, how we are trying to get to that PPC target by doing the MHAC program and holding hospitals financially accountable for the results. And the notion there is this cleanup process for the PPCs is going to help them for the care improvement and have them focused efforts. But the excluded PPCs or suspended PPCs shouldn't have that much of an impact on our overall trend. If things change and we see those PPCs are trending upward for whatever reason, then we would go back and look at them. And so that's why, thanks for correction, it's suspension, not exclusion from the program. So we'll still watch them, I think.
Just a comment about that. I'm just sitting here thinking about the original vision and intent of the MHAC program. And I know that originally in the waiver we talked about wanting to meet or exceed the level of quality that CMS establishes. And I know that the hacks, for instance, are fewer in number. So I have felt that we put a good bit of thought and creativity into what we want to do in Maryland. The confusion that I have now is that as we reflect on the last few years, we have vastly exceeded our goals. And granted, the first year we all admitted that we had to correct POA and documentation, and gradually most hospitals got into actual teams to look at aspiration pneumonia, for instance, or hemorrhages or whatever it might be. And quality really has improved. I think I can speak for not only my hospitals, but a number that I'm in contact with, that really quality has been, improving quality has been the real focus. So that's why I think we keep coming back to the Sentinel event issue. That's prevention of never as opposed to improving process and quality going forward. And again, it's dangerous waters to dip into a little, 1 or 2 Sentinel events, not all. If you get into all, it's a totally different program. It's almost like the Joint Commission. Joint Commission has a reporting program for Sentinel events, and in the state, this goes back 15 years. I think it's 7 events that we agreed we wouldn't pay for, and we held hands as state participants and all agreed, and I think we've all stuck to that. So my concern is the original vision of the program and what we promised, which is to improve quality. And if we want to keep that clean enough, I think that's why if we're going to compare ourselves to CMS, let's do it. But if we're not, then let's make a case for what we really want to achieve in Maryland, and hopefully achieve that. We already have, but make it better. So again, that's a case for leaving out all Sentinel events.
All of them.
Yeah.
Never events. Yeah, I remember. I think we have 7 currently in our program too, if I remember. So 5 or 7?
5. I could be wrong.
Should I be beyond just non-payment? Are other states doing something different with those measures?
So I'm familiar with Texas, who's using the PPC like us Medicaid program, and I do believe they have all the PPCs in their program. But that's something we need to look into.
Because it would be interesting if we're suggesting a different program, what that might look like. Right. If you're pulling it out.
Right.
I just worry from a perception standpoint that these wouldn't be included. It's almost as if we don't think they're important, which of course is not the case. We do think they're important. You know, it doesn't seem to be making a difference in terms of the hospitals improving their quality over time. So the focus is not necessarily an issue. You know, I understand the voluntary effort, but it is a voluntary effort that could go away, and it's also not necessarily documented. Does the commission get reports from the hospitals for all the cases that they had these that were not paid? I mean, could there be some mechanism of accountability to make sure that this is actually happening? Right, but so does the commission get this information then when there's a never event that here's this patient wasn't charged for that case or for whatever the addition would be? You know, maybe make it more rigorous if you're going to move in that direction. Would be my suggestion, to make sure there's a high level of accountability associated with it, and that it becomes a commission policy that these do not go into payment somehow.
Right. I think
let's make it
if you are not putting it in the scores, then the question is what to do with them. And I think we shied away from the payment adjustments in the past, but if you are removing from here, then I think the alternative could be doing the individual payment adjustments.
Right.
Which is,
take it out of global budgets.
Right.
They don't get, you know, revenue associated with those cases. You know, make it rigorous. One or the other.
We would incline to keep it in the program, as you can imagine. I don't. All right. So the next ones are the modeling results. So we wanted to share with you the year-to-date scaling for MHAC. So this is 2B1 table. So the revenues are estimated. So they are not real. They are not the actual fiscal year 16 global budgets yet. And then what you have here is the MHAC base year score. So this is the fiscal year 14 for this time period. And then calendar year to date is 3 quarters?
Through September for everyone but Hopkins.
3 quarters of data. So there's one more quarter that's going to go in here. And then here, if you remember, let's see. So if you go down your package and pull up this one first, the scaling, this is the point-based scaling that we have. It's 2B4. So the way the scaling works, we have two versions. One is if we reach the state target, and the other one is if we are below the state target. And as you see in the worst case scenario, the maximum penalty starts at 3%, and in proportionally it goes down to up to 0.5, and the rest of the hospitals do not receive any rewards nor penalties. If we exceed the state target, then the maximum penalty is down to 1% because we're saying as a state we did a great job, we shouldn't get the penalties as much. And then there are rewards associated with the higher scores. And then we kept the maximum reward at 1%. So with this, then you can now look at the first table. Since we are achieving our state target, we are on the second column. So we have both penalties and the rewards. And as you see, because of the movement of the improvement in the scores, that the total penalties are at 2 million and the rewards are at 17 million. So overall, you know, this is a positive adjustment to the statewide totals, that we are rewarding more hospitals than penalizing these hospitals. So the reason why we shift to a preset scale was we heard from the field that when it is a relative scale, first hospital never knew the impact of their improvement, so they wanted to know if they improve by X%, what will be the financial impact. And when you do relative scaling, it depended on the other hospital's movements. So that's why we moved to the preset scaling. And the reason why we tiered them was because we wanted to make sure we hit our 30% goals. So that's why we tiered them and made the scaling much impactful if you didn't reach it. So collectively, there is a collective punishment if you don't reach it, in a sense. And thirdly, we opened the place where, you know, there is no adjustments done. So this is kind of reflecting the fact that we want to do the adjustments on the top and the bottom, and then don't pretend that the measure was fine-tuned, that it was differentiating the performance in the middle. So with that, so we could, what you have is we observe, I'm sure you do too, a few hospitals have tremendous improvement in their scores. Our plan is to look at their data and even contact those hospitals to learn more about what interventions that they are doing, and kind of get a sense of what the implications are. So for this year, we are proposing no changes to the scaling nor the maximum penalties. We propose to have a 5% target for the state, and we reach our 30% goal on the. So we from the model perspective, we achieved our 30% reduction goal. In the past, we were estimating, you know, what we need to do to achieve that 30% goal. We no longer have that. Looking at the trends, we propose 5% for the upcoming year.
I just had a couple of comments. I mean, these are some of the comments that I think we made last year with regard to the scaling methodology. You mentioned using 2 tiers as a means of trying to, you know, provide extra incentive to meet a statewide target. I think, as has been discussed at the commission meeting, when you have that type of structure, it creates a contingent incentive. And ironically, it actually reduces an individual actor's incentive to move toward a goal because of that contingency. These are factors that are beyond the control of the hospital. So if you have a more punitive schedule associated with, you know, not meeting the goal, the hospital individually can't control that. It's, you know, a contingent or collective incentive like the sustainable growth rate. It has that type of feature as well. So I think, ironically, you're fighting against yourself by having these 2 tiers. I also see it as being extra, you know, complication that's not necessary. And the other objection we had last year is that you've got these what appear to be, you know, neutral zones where hospitals, their performance doesn't count towards a statewide goal. And I don't recall what the, you know, why this particular 0.5 was used as a cutoff, or in the other scale 0.41 down to 0.5. In general, I think it makes sense to have hospitals, each hospital's performance count toward the goal. And that would also strengthen individual hospitals' incentive to make investments. The last point that I'll make is that we still have concerns about the coincidence of a massive change in payment incentives coming at the same time that you see this very large improvement. It's not to say that we haven't improved quality in this state. I'm sure we have, and I congratulate the hospitals in doing so. But there is that, you know, direct correlation. When you change incentives massively and you get a result, it does raise questions as to what is really going on. Talking to 3M, talking to other coders, there is discretion in terms of how PPCs are identified and documented. And that discretion could have been affected by this incentive change. So I would advocate, because of that concern, not change the target, the statewide target, because we aren't clearly sure that there was a full 30% improvement or plus 30% plus. And also certainly rebase the comparison each and every year. Do not use the original base, because that would double reward hospitals for performance that may not be actual performance.
Any comments?
So just a couple comments here. One, to just clarify, I think on the payment scale, the cut points were related to where the median was. Is that right?
Right. We did 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 from the base scores.
Okay. And they were, I remember, based on the base scores, attainment. So I don't know if we've looked at what the payment scale would look like for this coming year, but I'm assuming we would rerun the fiscal 15 scores, attainment to the median, and go from there for the payment scale. The other thing to the points about the strength of the incentive, having two different scales was something that we recommended, because under the previous method, each hospital was doing the ranking. One hospital was pitted kind of against the other. So having a collective target was a way to further incent working together. And I think what we've seen with the improvement is that the incentive is plenty strong with the two there. So we don't think that you need to have an adjustment for every single hospital. I think the incentive is plenty strong there. And then the third point is about the statewide improvement target. We've met our goal. We met that in March. So from a waiver point of view, we've met that requirement. Having the payment scale in place, having the rebased norms and benchmarks, and the payment scale, there'll still be an incentive to continue to improve beyond that. And there will be this disincentive, or a penalty for performance that deteriorates. So considering all of that, we think that the statewide improvement target could be set at 0. And then the alternative scale, if you don't meet that, it would be in place if performance statewide deteriorated. And the one other thing that I want to bring up is we looked at what the national HAC performance has been, and in December, early December of this year, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality put out a report on the national program. And so what they looked at was, what has the national HAC program done over its life from 2010 to the most recent data they have is 2014. And in my mess of papers here, in the first year, from 2010 to 2011, improvement, there was a 2% improvement. 2010 to 2012, there was a cumulative 9% improvement. 2010 to 2013, a 17% improvement. And then at 2014, that improvement leveled off, and it stayed at 17%. So that's looking at the national HAC program. It's looking at what hospitals are doing nationally, and they had that improvement, and they've leveled off. So we're seeing that same leveling off in our MHAC data from month to month. When we look at those month-to-month trends, in the last 6 months, that improvement is leveling off. So we've gotten, as was said in that report from ARC, is that you get the low-hanging fruit first. It gets harder to get the more difficult improvements, and you'll see a slower rate of return. So that's happened nationally. I think we're seeing those same trends here. So for those reasons, we would say set that statewide improvement at 0, and there'll be more penalties if we deteriorate.
But so how did you, I mean, in terms of whether we reached the 30% or not, everyone agreed that there is some improvements related to documentation and coding. So what is the MHA's estimate like of what that is, right? So of the 30%, if we could come up with, if we can find a methodology to estimate the case mix index, we need some more information because from our perspective, 30% improvement and 26% came in the first year of that. So that is too fast for a real quality improvement, no matter how you look at it. We do understand focused efforts had actual quality improvements, but what is that? Is it 50-50? Is it 70? I understand we won't be able to ever calculate that, but in terms of the sense and in terms of a general ballpark figure, we need that information. If you are arguing that we are going to have a zero, we should have a 0% improvement goal. Without that number, the 30% is still questionable from the Commission's perspective. As far as the we are interested in the comparison with the national, and I'm hoping that in the future when we get the Medicare claims cleaned up, we could calculate and look at it vis-a-vis our performance to the national. I think that's something we should all try to do and congratulate ourselves if we are better than the nation, but I'm not sure where we are with the PPCs. And thirdly, the variation. So the 5%, we said, okay, what is the variation in the performance? Because quality improvement, right? If we reduce the variation, that's what the purpose is. And there seems to be still a lot of variation, even though we have the 30% improvement. If we try to reduce that variation, the gains from that reduction in variation is much more than 5%. So we do see that there is still room for, even though maybe the statewide levels are leveling off, the variation is still big enough that we could still get some improvements out of reducing the variation itself.
And just to be clear, I do expect that we will continue to see improvement. And I think when we do this rebasing of the norms, we should be really clear that when you rebase those norms, hospital scores, attainment scores are low. And when you look at that compared to the payment scale, there'll be penalties in place. So that in itself will be an incentive for hospitals to move up out of that penalty zone and into the reward zone. So I do think that there are still incentives in place without that, having that statewide target there, that each hospital does have that incentive to close that gap.
So
a couple of things. So the variation that you were describing, is it, and you probably may have already done that, possible to see if there's a pattern to that variation based on either geographic location or hospital size, and is it something that falls into a certain pattern?
Yeah, in general, the large hospitals, there is that large versus small hospital differences in the variation. Yes. Yep. And we looked at it as, we didn't do a very thorough analysis of what, the variation analysis, but we were trying to get a general idea about what the variation is and whether this 5% was a reasonable expectation, without doing a very robust analysis of it. The number that we get was around 17%. So, if that's the idea, we could try to create a robust analysis and see what that would look like. But at the end, compared to the 17, no matter what we do, if we do some adjustments, let's say it came down to 10%, I don't think, it's going to change. The adjustments we make on the variation will get us to a 0%. Yeah.
And so that question that was raised in terms of, how much of this improvement is coding and how much of it is real improvement, you could potentially sort of find additional quality measures that are less reliant on coding decisions only, perhaps if there is a proportionate improvement in either readmission rates or mortality rates, that would, again, it wouldn't be a one-to-one match, but at least if they're all going in the same direction, perhaps with somewhat similar percentages, then you could see, or if they diverge, you could potentially raise that question as to more focused study.
Yeah, I don't know if Steve Jenks is listening, but he and I have been trying to figure that out, how the trends are going together. But yeah, it seems like more complicated because of the other things happening in the observation stage and whatnot.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are things like that that should be done, and I applaud the fact that staff and mathematics are looking at trying to correlate outcomes and PPC measures. But length of stay, for instance, would be another thing that you could look at. You know, is length of stay moving in the direction with the cases that are now not having as many complications? I think there are other things that staff can do to try to get at, you know, what is real quality improvement versus what may be a function of the variability in documentation and identification of these as complications. There's some subjectivity at the clinical level as to whether a particular complication or symptom is a complication or not. So that you're never going to get at fully. And there are also variations from one hospital to another in terms of what their processes and procedures are for various complications. You could also look at more targeted audits. Potentially, I know you've done audits to see what the general level of coding is, but perhaps make them more targeted some way to try to determine if there are changes that are substantive or not. Also, there's this issue about palliative cases. My understanding is that the PPCs associated with the palliative cases that are coded as palliative, are removed from this analysis. And with the change in incentives, the proportion of cases coded as palliative, these are deaths in the hospital, doubled. So clearly you get a behavioral response as a result of these incentive changes that we need to be aware of and try to ferret out and understand better. And until you do that, I think it's folly to say that we go to zero improvement. That's a mission accomplished type of approach, which just in light of the circumstances that I mentioned, the big change in incentives is just not acceptable.
Can I ask, are we going to get to the...
Yeah, I was just going to go through the rest of them, but if you want to...
Well, no, I think it relates to this conversation in the sense of what that 5% means and what this program is still, we go down this route, what we're doing as far as penalties to hospitals.
I just wanted to show you I was trying to get at that revenue neutral zone and see if it has any impact. So this chart was supposed to look at the % change in score in the y-axis and the state scores on the x-axis. And the no adjustment zone is between 40 and 55. Am I? So you see, I realized since I did the percent, there's some math. I need to revise this, but in general, those who were in the penalty zone in the base year seem to have larger improvements compared to those who were in the reward zone. It's an opportunity, but also I need to revise it and do it at a percentage point. So, but in general, but then the revenue, the no adjustment zone, you see that it is majority of them actually had an improvement in their score. So in that sense, seems like because of the whether they're going to be penalized versus not because of the state differential, I do think that is beneficial, that they are still incented to improve, so we still hit the state target. The next one is the expected rate differences, 2B2 thresholds and benchmarks. So this is the ratios. So these are, one is the state average, and then the benchmark is the 25 top performing hospitals. So the fiscal year 14 versus 15 benchmark comparisons. So in here, and then you see the differences. So for PPC number 18, to score 10 points, the hospital was supposed to be 92% better than the average to get the score. And now they are going to be 60% better than the state average. So that's how this one.
Okay.
So the expected rate comparison. So in general, updating, this is the issue about whether we want to update the expected rate. It has differential impact for the HPPC, so this is kind of leveling all the improvements that we have based on each PPC. In general, the biggest impacts are on the, interestingly, the first one is PPC 18 that we had discussed. So when we combine them, we'll see what will happen. So some you will have more aggressive benchmarks, and some it's actually helping the update to the list. So I'm not going to go through the one with the red. So this is for your information. If you don't believe our word, this is the numbers. The combined versus exclusions have really no impact on the scores. And finally, the modeling we did for the next year, so 2B5. So this has blue and gray and orange columns on it. So this is probably the most important one of all the charts. So here we updated the expected rates and we calculated new attainment scores. So that's the fourth column. The blue scenario 1 projected MHAC score with no improvement from base year. And then here we modeled if we exceed the state target and kind of wanted to see what would 6% improvement do to these scores. And as you see, the impact in terms of the dollar amounts are at the very end. So in general, the way we did it is we, so this is not the 6% of the score improvement, this is the 6% of the PPC rate improvement, changing your ratios. So in that case, based on where you are, the reflection on the score improvements are different because it depends what score you get. If you got 10 score and you still improved by 6%, your score is not going to change.
Can I just point out something that is probably obvious to everyone, but as we ramp up the program, it becomes so visible. If you look at Table 2B5 and you look at the very bottom where really only a small number of hospitals are in the reward zone, look at the number of those that are very tiny. As a matter of fact, McCready, the last time I checked, was average daily census of 18. So, the concern is the probability if very few PPCs apply, if you're looking at relative rating in the state, it really becomes very obvious that we have to do something about size, complexity. I mean, if you look at those bottom 10, almost everyone, not everyone, but almost, are extremely small.
Yes.
So I think we have to be careful because it's beginning as we ramp up to look like the large versus the small, and the large hospitals that take high-risk patients. I would hate to think we would be less inclined to take high-risk patients because of the effect on quality. So I just want to point that out. I know it may be obvious to those of you who know all the hospitals, but they're really bifurcating here.
So risk adjustment, so it is about I think the nature of these hospitals as opposed to, like, risk adjustment should take care of the severity of illness, but we are working on in the expected rates to see if we could find a way to, so on the expected rates, if you think this is one PPC score, we take the top quartile performing hospitals, so all these small hospitals go into that benchmark for the score 10. So we are trying to find a way to get the expected rates calibrated so it takes larger proportion of the patients so that we don't, we try to correct that bias that we've been seeing. So we'll work on it, and for January, you'll see some adjustments to it. But in terms of the final recommendation, this is such a technical issue, so I don't, you may not see it in the final recommendation, but we'll definitely bring it to you for the January meeting to work that detail on the expected rate. Okay, I ate up an hour and a half on the MHAC. Thank you so much.
I mean,
yes.
I still have
sure,
obviously great concerns that even with the 6% improvement, 3 hospitals move out of penalty.
Oh, yeah.
How is, I mean, yeah. So we've met our waiver, essentially, and now we're going to significantly penalize our large hospitals. These financial impacts aren't insignificant, okay? And so where does the 5 or 6% come from? Meaning, what is that based on in the sense of what we can really do clinically to impact by 5 or 6%? And if even doing that, we have now put a significant number of any hospital that's doing complexity of care at risk. I have obviously bias, but I have great concern about a program that puts our hospitals in this jeopardy.
And the 6%, is an average. So if your score is lower, the expectation is your improvement is faster. I do, the small, like leaving aside so if you go back to that graph that I did, right? The lower your score, the higher your improvement rate. So to me, we gave you kind of a sense of what that looks like with the 6%. But if you plot if you compare this one to the one that we have year to date, you see that that 6% improvement is very minimum compared to what we did last year.
I appreciate that, and that's reality. But again, we keep talking about we have now this significant bifurcation, and I think that we're getting down to what can we now do? What opportunities do we have for that 5%? And I think they now vary dependent on the patients, the clinical services. And I know, we need to do something for future program planning that incorporates all of that. But putting these hospitals at risk this year, to me, I can't see the logic.
And I guess the risk is that since the hospitals rewarded account for a relatively small number of people's lives, then they can do perhaps a little bit better job of taking care of those relatively few people. But the sort of the big places that perhaps have people at greater risk anyway, and in large volumes, are now need to make do with less, and perhaps the net increase in risk is really truly in the wrong direction. We're creating a scenario where we may be creating greater risk using our reward scheme.
So the number-wise, the state average. Think about the state average on an APR, DRG, and severity of illness point of view. The larger hospitals are determining the state average at the end of the day. So this is about the tail end where we pick the top performing hospitals based on their rate. So, one issue, I think to me, the easiest way to handle it is like, would you accept different benchmarks, large versus small? Should we do separate scaling if that's the case? If you're concerned that large hospital, but then the average for the small hospitals would be their own average, and I don't think they're going to perform that well. So to me, it's about the the tail end where we are looking at the best performing hospitals and finding a way to look at it in a more size neutral way, as opposed to thinking that this scaling is not addressing the issues around the large hospitals. At the end of the day, they are determining the average score because of their size.
And the other point I was going to make is you say we're putting the hospitals at risk. I mean, what's the magnitude of the potential penalty that we're talking about here?
24 million.
But for 24 million for University of Maryland, you're saying?
No, I'm talking about the state.
Well, so
No.
but come on, at the individual hospital level,
Right.
that's you say risk. You have to look at what the magnitude of the potential penalty is at the individual hospital level. You know, 24 million relative to the level of the profitability of the industry is minuscule.
Okay, put reality, put sense to that. So just because you're a larger hospital, you can afford the
No. My point is this is a program that is designed to put pressure on hospitals to improve. And if that means putting them at a little risk financially to provide the incentive for that, that's justified in my mind. And instead of just broad statements about, oh, we're putting hospitals at risk. Yes, we are. This is an important program, and we should continue to put hospitals at risk. There may be issues of big versus small. If there are ways of looking at that to try to equilibrate that more fairly and effectively, that's fine. But this program needs to put pressure on hospitals, and this shouldn't be a mission accomplished type of attitude here for the industry. I just disagree with that attitude.
I actually agree with that, but I think the concern is something entirely different. It's the appropriateness of the penalty and the advantage or disadvantage based on size and risk and those issues. I think it's a totally different issue as to what the hospital can afford, and I do agree that there should be appropriate incentives. I'm just saying they have to be based on statistical reality and appropriateness, and I worry when the size issue seems to be so influential versus what we know to be a fact, which is smaller hospitals cannot take higher risk patients and don't do the breadth of procedures and care. So I think what we're talking about also is protecting the ability of our really top-level healthcare in Maryland to continue to provide that. We all agree quality has to be better, but I think every hospital agrees to that. I don't think anyone gets up every day and says, let's do poorer quality. So I'm just saying we have to look at our formulas here and make sure that we're achieving what we're intending to when we end up with the small hospitals advantaged and the large hospitals disadvantaged. That's all.
Right. We'll take a look at that. But
this trend between the difference in quality between large and small hospitals actually is seen nationally as well. So there was a recent study in Health Affairs done by the Federation of American Hospitals, and they looked at the three CMS programs, the HAC and the Readmission Reduction and the IQR program, and they found that the highest percentage of penalties for all three programs were clustered around large hospitals and academic medical centers and the smaller hospitals. Now, either the methodology nationally, no matter how, because CMS uses different methodology for risk adjustment and so forth, either all of it is flawed or there is some, variation in actual performance. So I don't know which one it is, but it seems like the experience that is being shown here is not out of sync with what's going on nationally.
And I think just one of the things from our perspective in seeing the types of patients that are moving between hospitals, especially within our system, in the past, we found that hospitals very much wanted to hold on to the acutely ill, complicated cases. And now more and more we see that there's shifts, and a lot of the smaller hospitals are not holding on to some of those sicker cases that could potentially lead to some of these things. And I think that's where the argument's being made, in that the larger hospitals are taking on that extra risk by virtue of accepting these patients and the services that they provide. And I think somehow we need to give thought to that. because I do worry a little bit about incentivizing the smaller hospitals, the smaller community hospitals, of just transferring these patients out.
Actually, if you not, we have transfer methodology that keeps hospitals like Hopkins and University, cases that are transferred from the smaller hospitals. So they are being paid on those cases already. So then managing the risk on those and comparing them to what you could achieve if you improve, because you're already being paid on those hospitals. Those hospitals that transfer the cases, their revenues are reduced and given to Hopkins and University to treat those patients. So I don't really see the risk that we are talking about, because we already pay for those cases at those hospitals. It's not like you are taking the cases from the smaller hospitals without paying the bigger hospitals for those cases. Yeah. So we have many different methodologies that handle many different things. So the transfer methodology is supposed to handle that aspect of that, and this methodology is supposed to handle the improvement portion of it.
Yeah, and I think that the point was a little less about whether the transfer to hospitals are being adequately paid for the transfers. I think that is a separate conversation that we're okay with and not really ready to engage in here. But it's more about in taking a larger volume, more acutely ill cases, that there is a risk that may not be picked up in the risk adjustment. But it does raise these questions, and we heard it already, that is the methodology different or is the performance different? And so it's not so much about the transferred cases, but there are more acutely ill patients there, and we have seen the correlation between volume and that. Not so much the average performance, but that best performance. And I think the work on those benchmarks and what that best practice could get to, I think that will be helpful. And I think in raising these concerns about when you look at this modeling with the 6% improvement, we see that differential between the hospitals at the reward end and at the penalty end.
So I've got a story which maybe takes us out of the realm of numbers, which might be a good thing. I'm mostly in the School of Public Health, but I have a couple of patients. And so I've got one patient who's was quite really an older guy who was hospitalized in a smaller hospital, which happens to be one of our hospitals. So I'm not pointing any fingers. And I would say that it is, he went right into the ICU because he had pneumonia, and he did not have something done which should have been done, which is he didn't have a chest tube placed. So he was really doing terribly. The family was really unhappy. They said, please, please, would you transfer him to Hopkins? So Hopkins said, actually, I said, sure. And so we moved him to our ICU. And we put in the chest tube that he needed. For a complicated set of reasons, he got some TPA in the tube, and he had bleeding, so that was a complication. So he's got now one complication. So he was still doing badly, and he'd been on pressors ever since, for the week that he'd been at the other hospital. So the next thing that happened was he developed a cold foot, and so he now had one of those vascular complications. He had an arterial embolism, which was terrible, and when that happened, the family said, well, he is in his 90s. He is now a palliative care case. We're going to actually withdraw support. But in the meantime, he did suffer, but he wound up getting, disconnected from everything, and he passed away, unfortunately. But this guy, probably, the family is still very, very grateful that he'd been transferred. He probably did get better care or more appropriate care after he was transferred. The case cost a bucket of money. It's not clear whether or not the reimbursement would have covered it. He had two complications which are recordable during that hospitalization. It's not clear whether or not he winds up in the palliative care bucket or not, because he died in the ICU, after all of this had happened. So I'm not sure that the family was happy. I'm not sure that the doctors felt it was the right thing was done. I'm not sure that Hopkins is totally happy about how they're going to get scored because of that case. And there's a sort of a lot of intangibles that that sort of go along with it that make the severity of illness piece hard.
I mean, in that case, in the sending hospital, you know, most likely their severity of illness was recorded at 1 or 2, I would think. When they are going into the ICU, it will bump them to 4, and then the expected for the 4s is much different than the 1s. So I do, you know, we do appreciate the performance differences, but at the same time, let's not overplay. The PPCs are case mix adjusted, so there is an adjustment for the severity of illness. To me, the issue is the type of PPCs we have are more surgically oriented. No matter what, you know, whatever we are doing is still not really getting at that, like the OB case, right? We discussed if they don't have OB, they are not measured. If you have OB, you get lower scores. We adjust the other hospitals' scores so they don't get 10 for the OBs, but nonetheless, they don't get any score. And on the one hand, that's kind of surgical PPCs, and we have the PQIs, prevention quality indicators, which are medical. So I think when we're thinking about it, this is one aspect of the care, and then you need to think about what we are doing and overall on the potential avoidable utilization. And some of these hospitals are getting dinged for the medical cases that as a proportion, they are getting more of those patients as opposed to the large academic centers. So
is it?
Actually, when we add the PQIs, and they're very, very much concentrated in the medical hospitals and not in the academic medical centers. And even with the new categories of potentially avoidable utilization that we're thinking of adding, for example, sepsis, I just finished looking at the data, and it's much more prevalent in the community hospitals and not the academic medical centers. So as we're adding additional areas to potentially avoidable utilization that are going to be part of the value-based programs, these things are being balanced out pretty significantly by the addition of other items in the other side of the equation, medical side. And you know, I think we've always had this surgical issue. We've always had surgical hospitals getting more PPCs than medical hospitals for as long as I've been around. It's not a new phenomena, and I think the movement of cases to more to centers is happening not just because of the payment model in Maryland. It's actually a national trend, because as we've done fewer invasive procedures, there's less need for ICU care in many hospitals, and the volumes start to fall so low that you really just don't have the capabilities, and it's not cost effective to have the capabilities in some hospitals that used to be there. It makes more sense to put high needs patients that really need high capabilities in more centralized location from a cost effectiveness and quality standpoint. I mean, that's just been a trend that's happened with technology from what I've seen.
Be interesting to see if there's a difference in performance with and without transferred in cases. If one could stratify and see, just for internal analysis, since the transfer-ins in some quality programs are exclusions, and they're not, I think, in this program.
So I'm doing a really bad job as a timekeeper. So I'm going to move to the, we're going to skip the consumer dashboard and pick it up in January. And I'd like to focus on the readmission for the remaining of the time. And in terms of the feature sets, we got some other additional analysis to do. We'll work on the expected rates, but I do expect that for the commission perspective, what they need to vote, we have enough that we are probably ready for the final in January. If you feel otherwise, please let me know. So for the readmission, we are going to start with the PowerPoint presentation, and then is Matt, are you on the line? Okay.
I'm here. Sorry.
All right. So we'll introduce Matt. Matt Sweeney is from Mathematica, the team who's helping us with the readmission program, looking at the risk adjustment as well as the annual updates. So let's just go.
Great. So let's just quickly, if you look at the PowerPoint slide number 2, we just want to update everyone on the CMMI waiver target metric, and I won't go through it in detail given time, but these are the changes between what we've been calling version 4 of the waiver metric and version 5. Again, exclusions for psychiatric rehab and a change in the transfer definition.
So so for those of you who joined us, so we should give you a little background. So our target is on the national readmission rate, so we need to reach to the national readmission rate by the end of the 5th year. But when we signed the agreement, there wasn't any hospital-wide readmission rate established. So we've been working since then to come up with a measure that will look at our readmission rate on an equal footing. In Maryland, we have these swing beds, or specially licensed bed psychs and rehabs, which are part of our acute hospitals and part of our count. In the national one, those are separated from the national. As you know, so the readmission risks are different. So when we look at our rate vis-a-vis the national rate, we said our rate looks higher because we have different patients in our count. So we wanted CMS to make an adjustment for those cases. Our ask was for them to calculate the national readmission rate differently, not to exclude the psych and rehab from our number, but add those numbers to the national one, because we think those patients are still part of the acute care hospitals. What CMS told us was that it wasn't possible for them to calculate them, because I think my understanding is they broke those claims from the very beginning, so they are not part of their claim stream. And they couldn't find a way to add them back. So the compromise was that they would exclude those cases from our Maryland numbers. And then there are some changes on the transfers, because now we have a hospital-wide readmission rate, so we tried to align that too. But in terms of the comparisons, the version 5 would be the final, and we think that it is a more appropriate way to compare, albeit we are not as happy because at the end they excluded them rather than changing the Maryland number.
So this next slide just shows you, again, the difference. So in the version 5 measure, the version 4 measure, the national rate would have been 15.78%, and the Maryland was 17.08, which was a gap of 1.3%. In version 5, the gap has been closed slightly, and you know that is being driven by the psych cases. When you remove just the psych cases, the gap actually goes down to less than 1%. When you remove just the rehab cases, the gap actually widens between Maryland and the nation. But in the end, it did close the gap during the 2013 year slightly with version 5. So going on then to the next slide, the next part, just quickly, oh, now I have the control, I forgot. So just really the updates to the readmission measure, we presented last time that we were going to change the transfer logic, and we since then have changed it slightly again, but it is going to align with our other transfer logic, which would be all same day and next day admissions. Currently it's only same day, and that's determined by the date. It'll be now all same day and next day admissions will be considered transfers, irregardless of diagnoses. And then we'll also be modifying the planned admission logic to be ICD-10 compatible.
Before we go in, any questions on the measure? So psych and rehab are excluded from our target, but we are keeping them in our program because we think those populations are part of the acute care setting and they should be measured and improved.
I'm sorry, as the new kid on the block, when you say you're keeping the psych measures and rehab measures in the program, what does that mean?
So our progress in our contract is measured with the national number. So when they're looking at our readmission rate, they're going to compare Maryland's readmission rate to the national one, excluding psych patients, because they couldn't add it to the. In our payment adjustments, when we measure the hospital performance, they are part of that hospital performance for our own payment program.
So we really didn't want to remove them because we think there's considerable opportunity for reducing readmissions and admissions of psychiatric patients, and it's a really important measure for Medicaid and for dual eligibles, and so we want them front and center as part of our readmission program. We're not going to take them out of the all-payer program. We really didn't want to take them out of the Medicare program, but they just needed to be taken out of the national numbers for the comparison. So we're just saying, hey, we're keeping them in. They really need the attention of focusing on community-based support so that we're not having admissions and readmissions, and we're not taking them out. Just because we took them out of the national measure doesn't mean that we're taking them out of the Maryland measure. They're staying in.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
So now we are turning to math. So then, maybe before we go into math, there is one of the asks from the last meeting was to the statewide rankings, and we pulled together an information from Medicare public files, the geographic variation files. So they are a little bit dated. So 2013 is the most recent year. But in terms of seeing who are the best performing states, right? We've been looking at so our comparison is to the national number. And so the first one is the hospital-wide readmission rate. And this is not what you're going to see in our table. So the measures, definitions are different nonetheless. What you see is the Maryland is ranked 49th hospital state. And then you can see the best performing hospitals are mostly on the West Coast, but you do have a few that are close to us. And then the range, I think one of the issues was in terms of our thinking, what will be the lowest readmission rates that we could achieve. Obviously we won't be comparable to Idaho, but they have the 13% hospital readmission rate. Just in terms of the other things that we thought would be beneficial to note, we added the inpatient covered stays per 1,000. So there we are ranking 36 for the days. So we may have shorter length of stay, but looks like we are ranking at 41st. On the emergency visits, we are 33rd. So then the last three columns are the per capita cost. So this is the total cost, not hospital. But on the total cost, you see that we are ranked 51 on an actual cost. Then you standardize for variations in geographies and some of the rate adjustments that we have. It goes, we are improved to 35th. And then when you have a risk adjustment, this is the patient level risk adjustment factors, we are at the 32nd in terms of ranking. So I thought, looking at the data together, originally we started with one column. Of course, when I get it, it always goes into more. So this is something to also considering in terms of our readmission program. We have a high readmission rate, and we have high admission and utilization rates as well. So the issues are around utilization as well as the readmission.
The risk adjustment is based on APR or the Medicare?
I believe they do Medicare MSCRGs.
Right.
Mm-hmm. If you like, we could send you the link to where we got this data, and they have a documentation.
But it was based on the methodology that CMS uses.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then they do have different risk adjustments because this includes nursing homes, home health, so they have different adjustments for those to get to the standardized. I'm not sure how they're handling our hospital adjustments because of the rate structure that we have. We've been talking with them. It's better than before in terms of methodology, but I think it may be now adjusting too much.
So this is the ILM?
Yes. This came out of IOM report, and CMS is now publishing regularly on an annual basis.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're using the HCC, so I think we have the file so we can look, but it may, the HCCs aren't really meant to necessarily risk adjust below the total cost of care, but I don't know if these are risk adjusted based on HCCs, so we can look.
Yeah, we'll take a look. All right, Matt, I think now it's your turn. So now we're going to shift to our own program, and the questions are, what the national, so for our program, we need to estimate what the national reduction is going to be, because we need to match that on an annual basis and to close the gap between the national and Maryland's rate. So we asked Mathematica to help us with the projections, and they did some analysis, and they'll talk about the trends and what they've seen in the data.
And so I think, Matt, I'm going to be controlling the slides. So if you, this is Allison, if you could tell me when, and here we go.
All right, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. You can go ahead and advance, Allison. Thanks. So as Shuli just said, part of the required goals of RIP is to know where the national Medicare fee-for-service rate is going to be. That could help provide some goalposts to assess the state's progress in meeting the waiver targets, and also will allow us to develop some fee-for-service improvement targets for the state by year. And in turn, once we know what those fee-for-service targets need to be, or those improvement targets need to be, we can use those to inform what the all-payer improvement targets need to be within the state, within the RIP, so that when hospitals reduce their all-payer rate within the RIP, it translates into the necessary reduction in the Medicare fee-for-service rate to meet the waiver requirements. Now, this is actually a really interesting question to tackle currently, because there's actually been some changes in the national fee-for-service rate in recent months and quarters. For a couple of years, the national fee-for-service rate has been decreasing fairly consistently, but recently that trend has really flattened out. So, for example, the cumulative reduction in the national fee-for-service rate from 2011 to 2013 was about 5.6%, but the cumulative reduction from 2013 to 2015, at least projected for 2015, is only 0.6%. So the question is really, we've had this period of downward trajectory of the national fee-for-service rate, so now some recent evidence that it's slowing down or even flattening. So the question now is, where is it going to be? So what we've done is we applied a variety of methods to try to predict the readmission rate through calendar year 18. And instead of trying to, given all the uncertainty and trying to make one singular prediction, one point estimate of what that rate's going to be, we wanted to develop a range of predicted values to account for the inherent uncertainty in any of these projections. And once we sort of had a range of potential projected fee-for-service rates at the national level, we could develop a range of fee-for-service improvement targets around various scenarios and assumptions. Next slide. So what we did is we used the monthly Medicare fee-for-service national readmission data that CMMI provides to HSCRC for monitoring, and we used the data from January 2011 through June 2015. There were some more recent months of data available, but the claims were not complete, so we threw those out. We stopped at June 2015, and we're using version 5 of the measure specifications, and you just saw what version 5 is like compared to version 4 and some of the impacts. We use a couple of different statistical models to help us with this. I'm not going to go into all the technical detail of these, but we use two that are called ARIMA and LOIS. Intuitively what these models are doing is they're using historical data and patterns in historical data to project what the future readmission rates are going to be. And to do this, what the models do are essentially decompose the data into a couple different components, one being the underlying trend in the data, and then also the seasonality in the data. So in any given year, you might see expected deviations from the trend based on the time of year. So for example, in these data, you see large spikes in December in the readmission rate. So these models basically model and project both trend and seasonality separately, and then pull them back together for the purposes of projections. The added feature of doing these models is that they actually yield a not only the projected rate, but also the 95% confidence interval around those rates. So it at least models or estimates what the uncertainty is around any of those projections, at least based on the underlying assumptions of the models. We also took a kind of maybe a less complex approach and just did a simple 2-year moving average to see what that approach would imply in terms of where these rates are going to be. And one of the findings that we found was that all three of these methods came up with very, very similar projections for the rates in 2016, 2017, and 2018. I'll show you what these are in just a minute. Next slide. So this graph on slide 9, this is the projections from the lowest model. The UREMA model produced a graph that was almost identical, so I'm just showing one of these just for simplicity. The line sort of on the left-hand side of this graph is the actual monthly readmission rate, the actual data we have in hand. And if you started on the left-hand side of this trend and traced your finger through all the peaks and valleys, you would see the downward trend that I was just describing through about 2014, at the beginning of 2014, and then it starts to flatten out from 2014 and 2015. On the right-hand side of this graph, or it should be showing up as a blue line with some shaded regions, these are the projected point estimates of the monthly readmission rates coming out of this model. And the shaded regions correspond to the narrower band is the 95% confidence, the 80% confidence interval, and the wider band is the 95% confidence interval. And what you can see is that what this model is predicting is a readmission rate in 16, 17, and 18 that's very, very similar to what we're observing in 2015. And truly what's going on here is that this model is really kind of discounting that much earlier downward trend in 2011, 2012, and 2013, and putting more weight and more emphasis on the more recent trend, or lack thereof, in the national rate. And it's also projecting the seasonality by month. But if you, again, took your finger and drew it through the peaks and valleys starting in the middle of the graph all the way out to the right, it would be a pretty straight line. Next slide, please. This is just using the less complex approach, just using moving averages. So this is just showing the 24-month moving average in the data we have, and again, just confirms that the downward trend that we observed in the earlier months and years is slowing down by the current time period. Next slide. And if you projected that 24-month moving average out to 2018, this really kind of hammers home that it's a really flat trend. That's a very, very straight line, starting from 2015 going all the way out to 2018. Next slide. So all three of these approaches that we took indicate no trend in the national rate, and the projected rate is across all these models is really about 15.4%, which is roughly equal to what it is currently. Now, I do want to mention that all of these approaches are just statistical packages that are taking historical data, modeling the patterns of those data, and then making projections forward. And so one question, when I kind of bring a human element into this, is, should we believe those projections? I mean, would you really want to assume that the national rate's not going to be changing from what it is now? The model projections, as I said earlier, are really based on the recent lack of trend. But one question that we had is, well, what if the pre-2014 reduction or decrease in the rates happens again? So in other words, if starting today the national rate resumed its downward trajectory equal to something like we saw from 2011, 2012, 2013, where would the national rate end up? So we're kind of considering two broad scenarios. Scenario one is the trend remains flat, so we sort of take the model predictions as they are. But scenario two is one that is an alternative scenario where we assume that starting today the average decrease observed since 2011 will start to occur again. In other words, the recent flattening of the trend is more of an abnormality or an aberration, and that really what's going to happen is that the national rate is going to start to go down again. This is just an assumption. It's just a way to sort of lay out an alternate scenario. Next slide. And so this is what that scenario looks like. So again, you see on the sort of left-hand side of the graph the downward trajectory, the slowdown in 2014 and 2015, but then we impose a scenario in which the rate starts to decrease at a rate equal to the average reduction we observed in the data. And under this model, you see that the national rate starts to, by 2018, is down around 14.6%. Next slide. So all this is to say, there's one takeaway from this, is that there's a lot of uncertainty in all these projections, and we're not really wanting to hang our hat on any one of the projections per se, but we wanted to come up with a range of what could be feasible values of where the national fee-for-service rate is going, and then base some improvement targets based on each of those scenarios. So in other words, develop a range of what the improvement targets need to be. So we're going to show you some results based on 3 different approaches, or 3 different numbers, really. The first approach is using the observed annual change from calendar year 14 to 15, and assuming that that annual rate of change will persist in 16, 17, 18. That's I think is currently what's been done in the past. The second approach is taking those statistical estimates that I showed you, but instead of taking the point estimate, taking the lower bound. So this sort of, again, incorporates some conservativeness and incorporate some uncertainty into the projections. Instead of saying that the rate's going to be exactly equal to what it is in 2015, let's assume it's at the lower bound of that projection. And then finally, we're going to show you some numbers based on quote-unquote scenario 2, the scenario in which this recent slowdown in the trend is actually an aberration, and the national rates actually start a downward march once again. And we're kind of presenting as a again, quote-unquote worst-case scenario. It's not to say that reducing readmission is a bad thing, but in terms of the state meeting its targets, this scenario would provide the more challenging, because the state would have to really ramp up reductions in own rates in response to that scenario. Next slide. So this table should look familiar. This has been, I'm sure, presented to you in the past. We've updated this with the version 5 data as well as the data through June. So a couple things to note here. The first is that the year-to-date change, projected change in 2015 over 2014 is about 0.63% reduction. And then moving down column 1 in sort of the bottom panel here, if you assume that 0.63% reduction every year, you can see where the projected national rate is going to be by 2018. It's around 15.1%, 15.09%. On the right-hand side, the implied targets for the state of Maryland on the fee-for-service side are also shown, and as you can see what the target reductions need to be to achieve that goal by 2018. The other thing I wanted to point out too is that if you look at the year-over-year changes starting in calendar year 12, every year the state, based on the updated data, the state is outperforming the national rate in terms of rate of change. So every year the rate of change within the state of Maryland is greater than the rate of change observed nationally. Next slide. I think this is my last slide, actually. So now what we're showing here is based on these 3 different sets of numbers about where the national rate is going to be, what are the implied fee-for-service targets for Maryland. So the top panel is showing the actual targets in terms of the rate, and the bottom panel is showing what the cumulative target needs to be relative to the calendar year 13 Maryland fee-for-service rate. What you can see is that when you use the observed rate of change and you use the lower bound, basically the second and third columns, the numbers are very, very similar. Scenario 2 on the far right, not surprisingly, implies that the target rates need to be much lower and the cumulative reduction targets need to be much higher in magnitude relative to the other 2 approaches. So again, this sort of sets up a range of maybe potential values in terms of the targets that need to be achieved to meet the national fee-for-service targets in the future. And I'll stop there because I think the next step is taking these and projecting them into the readmission reduction program, the readmission incentive program, and the alt-payer targets. So I'll turn it back to Allison or Shulay.
Any questions for Matt? So one thing, we need to keep in mind, if we did the same analysis before the slowing down happened, it would have projected right down. So even though it is helpful to do these, at the end of the day, we are kind of in the same place as we were before these projections. We really have not a good sense of what the national number is going to be. And given our target, we need to be aggressive in terms of maybe we won't assume the scenario 2, but I think it will be risky to assume the current growth rate as well. So we are hoping that this is going to give us a range, and at the end of the day, the number is determined by non-statistical methods. And I did some updates, and we apologize. We sent them yesterday. As you know, we are working really hard, and some of these things are taking longer than we want. Last night, I added the monthly trends. I said, oh, let's see what the monthly trend shows, complicated stuff aside, what is our performance now for calendar year 15? Are we continuously different than the national one? And it seems like majority of the gains that we had were in April. You see the dip, so that the top is the Maryland trend, readmission trend, and the red one is the national trend. So we are doing better than the national reduction. So the national is at 0.6%. We are about 2.5. But it looks like majority of that actually came from a sharp decline we had in April. And then it looks like our June and July, especially July trend is also much faster than the national. But it does kind of also give me a pause to, be cautiously optimistic about these numbers. You don't see a consistent trend that our number is going much faster down than the national one. And just for comparison, in 2014, we did better than the national trend, but not as much. So the difference between national and ours is about 1.5%, as opposed to 3% right now we're seeing. And here, you can see that in general we pretty much followed the national one, except that the gains were coming from January and February timeframe. So we are going to continue to look at it and also incorporate this monthly trend information in addition to the projections that we have. Any questions on this? Yep.
A couple of questions. So I assume that the national rate for 2013, which shows here as 18.1%, and over here in this is 15.38%, is because of the difference in methodology?
Yes.
So I guess then, since we're sort of hypothesizing, it looks like the spread on that large spreadsheet is significant when you compare the western states to, I guess, the midsection and the Northeast. It looks like that's kind of how they're eyeballing it, breaking out. So if we assume that the ones that are doing really well are probably maxing out on the downward trajectory, then the real key will be how these people who have very high rates, including the district, whether they can actually move the needle more on their side, because they have more opportunity for improvement. So that's the group that perhaps one needs to focus on, because they're the ones who might drive the national rate going forward, because they have the largest opportunity. I'm making a lot of assumptions in this, but I'm just saying that the district being at 22% to 22.6%, whatever the factors may be for that, has a better chance of moving towards 18% rather than Idaho going down to 10%, for instance, based on the data that they're showing with things flattening out once the initial reduction has happened.
And it is interesting, but one thing that I just want to point out in terms of our model in Maryland, our model with CMS is based on us being able to reduce avoidable utilization faster because we are organized on an all-payer basis and we're implementing care delivery transform, and we're able to, as a result, we're able to implement care delivery transformation faster. So, so in order to make our model balance, if you want to put it in that perspective, overall, we have to reduce avoidable utilization about 2.5% faster than the national average is reducing. So that is really an important point to think about in terms of policy development on an ongoing basis, is that if we have a model that's supposed to be moving faster than the national average, that we need to make sure that as we think about what's going on and how we should reflect that in our quality payment programs, that we also build those reductions that we need to make the model balance into the quality programs. And so we do have other points besides readmissions, we also have PQIs, and we may add some other categories of avoidable utilization. But across the board, we really have to be moving down more than 2.5% faster than the national average.
So Donna, that's 2.5% per year, or cumulative?
Yes.
So that's
roughly, right now, it's about 2.5% per year more rapidly on avoidable utilization, because right now the federal government is giving 0% rate increases, and we're giving 2% rate increase. So that would put us upside down on our ability to give a rate increase if we don't have a reduction in utilization. So given where we are on utilization, and the fact that we are putting in managed care approaches into reducing avoidable utilization, we ought to be able to move down faster. But those are kind of the mechanics that are driving our system, and so I want to make sure that people focus on those mechanics when we think about quality programs, because if we say, oh my gosh, we can't hit 2.5% utilization reduction, then we have to lower the rate increase. I mean, that's kind of how the mechanics work. And so I just want to make sure that everybody understands our model is based on reducing avoidable utilization faster because we're working on this very significant care delivery transformation. So does that make sense? So just want to make that statement. So as we start thinking, oh wow, this is great, we got a little federal slowdown, that is great. And ain't it great that December's warm and we're not having people in the hospital with pneumonia this month? That's really good, so I'm happy this month. Not so happy last year in December and January, but this year, yes. So we really have to keep that in mind as we head into our quality policy development. So I just want to make that.
Yeah, I was going to make some similar comments in that regard. I mean, I think just in general, it's helpful to try to forecast out where the U.S. is, because beating the U.S. is very important from the waiver agreement standpoint. But at the same time, we don't want to just shoot to by either. That raises the point you mentioned about you risk not beating it if you're just trying to match it. And arguably reducing readmissions is a very good thing. We should be shooting for much below the U.S. decline, particularly since we are very high. And readmissions are correlated to quality. And so for all those reasons, I think, and the reason that Donna mentioned of the trade-off between rates and utilization on the total cost of care, we need to be quite aggressive on the readmission.
I'm very anxious to give you your total rate increase, so I'm sure you're anxious to get it too.
So I just want to make sure that I've got my math right. When we look at calendar year 2013, the base rate, our gap between Maryland and the nation is 7.99%. And if our waiver target is to reduce that gap by 1/5 each year, what I've got is for 2014, our gap would need to be 6.39%. For 2015, it need to be 4.8%. And then 2016, 3.2, and 2017, 1.6, and 2018, we'd be at the national average. So that's our waiver test. But going back to 2015, if our gap needs to be 4.8%, and right now we're at 4.2, and if we continue the same trends, we'd be at 3.25. Am I reading that right?
Yes, but the way we are doing is we are dividing the rest of the remaining into equal parts. So if we reduce the gap faster in the original one, we are giving the credit for it. So then the remaining gap, so the target versus the remaining for 16, 2.17, it's divided equally for the remaining years. So we are not doing that.
So if we were to, so then let's say, if I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. What I was thinking was that if our gap is 7.99%, in the base year. Each year we reduce by one-fifth of that. And so if we make less progress in the first year, then in the second year we have to catch up. If in the second year we make more progress, then the next year is a little easier. So that we're still, each year, that gap target, or the target gap, doesn't change based on your prior performance. It just becomes easier or harder to hit.
Yeah, I don't think that's what you said. What you said is we reset it each year so that we're dividing it over the remainder. Otherwise, if we took what you said to be the case, then that would say we could go backwards. And we're not going to set a policy in place that says you can go backwards, particularly since it's driving the revenue targets. And we approved revenue targets based on you going forward, so we're not going to approve something that would allow you to slip backwards.
Right. I wasn't saying that, and I think we might be saying the same thing, but I'm not sure. So.
But if you said we had to get somewhere in 5 years, I'm just going to make up a theoretical thing that, let's say you had to hit 5% reduction.
Yeah.
Well, if you got a 3% reduction in the first year, then you're saying, oh, well, what's my second year target? Well, in the model that you just said, it would be -2. You could slide backwards 2% or 1%. And Julie's saying, now we reset the target to 3 to go in the second year, and then it's 3 divided by 5 years. It's not 1% a year anymore. It's you got 3 in the first year, and then you have to get the remaining
so let me ask this
2% in the remainder. So you can't slide backwards in whatever quality measures were set because you already got the money in your rate increase.
Right. And I'm not saying slide backwards, but just want to make that clear. And I'm not trying to be argumentative.
No,
it's
just a little math thing, though.
I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
So let's just say if we close the gap completely in 2016. Let's say we were at the national average in 2016 for purposes of the waiver test, not for the payment policy, but for the waiver test. If we close that gap in 2016, then our target in 2017 for the waiver purposes, not for the payment policy, but for waiver purposes, is to maintain that 0 gap with the nation, right?
Right.
It wouldn't be to go further. You might make a payment policy that goes further, but for waiver test purposes, it's 0.
Right.
So then, if we missed that in 2016, if we missed our target in 2016, or if we were 0.5% away from the nation in 2016, so again we're ahead of schedule, but we haven't met the target, then our waiver target for the next year doesn't change. Your payment policy may change, but the waiver target doesn't change in 2017. That's the point that I'm trying to make, that as I look at these numbers, the 7.99 gap, how that's reduced each year doesn't change. Payment policy may change, but that gap target doesn't change.
Right, so the CMS target wouldn't change, but we still might have a higher readmission target for the state because that's part of what's driving our payment policy.
Got it. Yeah, we're on the same page as that. And so then the point really that I was making was more from a waiver target point of view, which is to say that in 2015, our waiver test, our gap target is a gap of 4.8%, and right now we're at 4.2, and if we continue on the same trend, we'll be at 3.2. So waiver test-wise, we're well on our way for this year for hitting that target. Right. That was the point of it.
If the national rate reduction holds,
right.
And if you remember the discussion last year, the number was positive, that the national number was increasing at 0.6. Final number came, well, actually it was the opposite. It was showing a decline, but then it turned out to be an increase again. So we just want to make sure, right now, looking at it, we are in good shape compared to last year. Last year, we couldn't, even looking at this number, we weren't matching it. This year, we have a nice cushion, and hopefully if the trend holds, we are going to meet our target. And our target is going to remain constant. But in the payment program, we are adjusting the target based on the improvements that we had in the previous period.
I do think the weather is pretty good in some other parts of the country right now too, so we might be having readmission reductions, and I mean the flu does cause some readmission problems, so hopefully we're having less than other places, but we might end up not being exactly where we think because we had that little flu pop last year.
Yeah. I just had a question on the wording again on the slide in reference to the exclusion of stays where a psychiatric condition is listed as a primary diagnosis in claims for the index admission or readmission. In practical terms, if someone goes into a hospital, has schizophrenia, is actively hearing voices, but is complaining of chest pains, how does that, they have a primary diagnosis, I'm assuming, of schizophrenia, but they're also going for another reason. So how does that work out? That would be coded as a chest pains issue?
Medical comes first for obvious reasons.
Right. The reason for coming to the hospital would...
Well, she said he was delusional too, so there's a
would you turn on?
Oh,
yep.
Apologize. So you did identify the fact that the patient was delusional and had chest pain. But from an algorithm perspective, chest pain comes first, so you have to treat that. Theoretically, that should have been the code. Now, to be honest, I don't know what happens 2 weeks in that stay. The chest pain is resolved, and then the psychosis becomes the primary. But the care would be associated with the psychosis and not the chest pain. I guess I was just, that makes sense, because when I looked at it, it doesn't say as the primary diagnosis, it says a primary diagnosis. So I just didn't know if a person is presenting with two, and one is psychiatric, does that then exclude that admission from being counted because one of the diagnoses is psychiatric?
So I think the coding guidelines are very clear about this. There's only one principal diagnosis, and it is the condition that you went to the hospital for. Now, there's variation in how that gets interpreted, but that is the clear sort of specific guideline that if you went to the hospital and you said you are there because you're hearing voices, then that is your principal diagnosis. But I think it gets a little muddied because in the same interview, they say, well, I'm here for this also. So there is some leeway in that, but at least from a definitional standpoint, a principal diagnosis is what brought you to the hospital. And so, again, as I said, there is a little bit of that leeway, but that's, that's what it is.
Right. The purpose was to handle the special licensed psych beds in the national comparison, and those patients who are admitted to those beds would have primary diagnosis as psych. And when you look at the data, proportionally, Maryland hospitals had more psych patients compared to the national, which kind of proved to us that it was a data issue, the licensed bed issue, rather than our performance on readmissions. But in our program, they are part of the acute care hospitals and part of the revenues. They are all in our program, so we are not making any exclusions based on psych codes, but we are adjusting for APR, DRG, SOI. So if the hospital is having more psych patients, then their score is adjusted for, so they are not penalized for taking care of psych patients.
And one more question, and this may be just me, and maybe it doesn't affect other people. When there is a percent difference shown here, and there is also a target percent, it's shown as a percent of a percent, and I always have a difficulty interpreting that. Perhaps the nominal difference may be something to consider.
Yeah, we did both ways when we started this work, and I think at the end people were comfortable losing the percents. I feel like, that it will be easy to do.
Just saying that you still have to convert that in your head.
Yeah.
Okay, what does 2.5% of 18.1% mean?
Right. So in terms of the, I put together a schedule where you could kind of see historically what we did in each year. And I apologize, there is a correction. So in this schedule, I'm looking at the CMMI Medicare readmission rate targets and performance summary. So in calendar year 14, rate, when you were looking at the performance, the difference between Maryland versus national based on the data, you were looking at 8.9% difference between the national versus Maryland rate. So this was before version 4 even. This was the initial data that we got, and then we used this as a benchmark. And then we assumed, because the trends were higher, we assumed, if you remember, some of you would, we assumed 5% national reduction in the modeling. And the actual came out to be at 0.35%. So you could kind of compare those two. And then the next one is the cumulative at 0.35. Based on this 5% assumption, to close the gap of 8.9 1/5, we said the Maryland Medicare target would be 6.76%. This was the first year of the program. The actual, national rate declined, but ours also, ours also slowed down. So our improvement rate was at 0.85% that year. And in that year, our Medicare target was the same as the all-payer target. So when you look at the very last column, you see that the all-payer target was at 6.7%. Coming to calendar year 15, the calibrated number for the base year, now this is the correction, the calibrated number is 8.2%, like the original number for the base year. So, with the revisions, we are calibrating our base year difference. So 8.9 percent number became 8.2%. So our model from the get-go was a little different. And the rate of change we assumed in calendar year 15 was 1.3%. And the year-to-date number now is coming around 6.3%. Cumulatively, we are at 0.98% for the national numbers observed. Based on the 1.3 projection, we said the Medicare target is at 3.9%. Everyone is with me so far? So then the actual right now, we are below our target at 0.3% 5, but at the same time, the national is slower, so we are good on our target as we discussed before. So cumulatively, our actual improvement rate is at 4.6%. In terms of target, and our cumulative improvement is at 5.4%. So last year, when we look for the trans Medicare versus all-payer, we were concerned that the all-payer rate was declining much faster than the Medicare line. And if you remember, the discussion was whether we should separate them, have Medicare only, so we make sure we hit the Medicare target. We end up adjusting the all-payer target upwards to make sure we hit the Medicare target. So that number we put in was 1.9% difference, percentage point difference. So we got to our current target of 9.3% all-payer improvement target. So we moved from 5.4% Medicare to 9.3. So that's kind of because the all-payer target is moving faster. So now the last threes are the modeling results. So first of all, our base year to national number is now at 7.9%. That's the correction. Our assumed, you see the scenarios based on math and analysis. So 0.63, it could be 0.7, or the historical trend is 1.6%. And when you do the similar math, what we get to is the, on the Maryland target, on the cumulative one, you could look at the cumulative target of 6% versus 9%. That's the range on the Medicare numbers. And then when we add the all-payer difference, which is smaller this year than the last year, then the range comes to 9% to 12%.
And that's just so I'm understanding, when we talk about the cumulative target, we mean, for this purpose, calendar 2016 compared to calendar 13.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So the current rate is projecting, a number lower than our current 9.3. But because of the uncertainty around the rate and also our need to reduce the utilization overall, we think it has to be more than 9.3%. So, but the top scale there is 12%. So we did a similar modeling, if you remember, last year. So the range is there, and it would come up with a number between 9.3 and 12%.
So that's where, Tracy, where we would definitely wouldn't go backwards and say we're going to lower it below 9.3, because then I would just turn around and go over to the rate increase and subtract it straight off of there too. So I think that the issue then partly gets to, what do you want to set it at, gets to be partly the rate dynamic as well. Okay, and the fact that we're investing a lot of money in care coordination that's focused on reducing utilization. So what do you want to do in terms of setting targets, and how does that ultimately play through?
Yeah, and I think thank you for doing this. It's helpful to see it all laid out and help us remind us how we got there. I think we agree we can't set a target for the third year that's lower than last year. And I do think with the infrastructure investments that Maryland is much better positioned than the rest of the nation to continue working on the readmission reduction. Our global budgets are set up as another incentive for that the rest of the nation doesn't have. And I think we see in Maryland's trend that first year is ramping up, and now we're really in full swing on readmissions reduction. So I do expect that we'll continue to see readmissions reductions in Maryland. Don't know what to say about the rest of the nation.
So I guess in terms of we are over 10 minutes, I'm just going to go through this, but also keeping in mind when we are discussing MHAC versus readmission program, we have, I like them both, they are all my programs. But in terms of time management, I do think we should spend more time on the readmission and think about what we want to do. And on the MHAC, some of those issues have been there, and then in the future, hopefully, we are going to look at them all together in one place. So just in terms of the remaining, what you have in front of you is the scaling points. So this was determined last year. So the 9% improvement is the place where we start giving rewards. And if the hospital doesn't perform to 9.3% reduction, then they would get penalized in proportion to their improvement rate. And we kept it at the 9% increase. So any hospital that has 9% or higher rate increase, then they would get the 2% penalty based on the inpatient. And what you have is the next one is we did the year-to-date scaling similar to the MHACs, and this data runs through August, and you see the distribution of the hospitals and which hospitals are hitting 9.3% target and the associated revenue adjustments. So overall, we are concerned with the hospitals that actually are moving in the opposite direction. So if you look at the bottom of this list, you see that there is a hospital, a few hospitals, actually their readmission rate increased by 10%. I think the idea about our program was we are incentivizing improvement no matter where you are, and it's a percent improvement, so it takes into account if you have a small percentage, your improvement is smaller. So we are concerned with the hospitals. We are concerned we are not meeting the target, but we are additionally concerned with the hospitals who are moving in the opposite direction. And lastly, we are talking about the socioeconomic adjustment factors in terms of assessing what the readmission rates are, but looking at the analysis, improvement is not connected with the socioeconomic adjustment. So if you are focusing on the improvement program, again, we need to think about the other factors that we were highlighted in the recommendation, like the denominator issue and other issues, to see if we are unfairly assessing some of those improvement rates. But from our initial analysis, socioeconomic adjustment is impacting the attainment score more so than the improvement score. And as you can see, bounce scores, we give that all the time, but they are nobody disputes they are disadvantaged population, no matter how we measure it, yet they have one of the biggest improvements in their readmission rate, supporting the idea that the higher readmission you have, maybe you have more opportunities to improve the care with in short time.
So one question here, you touched on it just a little bit, and that is about the looking at denominator issues. And are we going to come back to this group with some ideas of protections? Because when we look at the calendar 13 year-to-date risk-adjusted readmission rate, those hospitals that are on the bottom, which are the ones who had the biggest readmission rate increases, they've got pretty low readmission rates. And I would also say that
they're not pretty low. They're necessarily there. They might be pretty low for Maryland, but they aren't. If you actually look at other hospitals in other parts of the country, there are lots of them that have lower readmission rates than those hospitals, significantly lower for the same types of population. So I don't want to.
Well, I don't know if we really know which hospitals match well with Easton or Garrett or Prince George's, but when I look at their rates, it's significantly lower than the rest of the hospitals.
Also isn't that having the DC issue?
Right.
So I don't we have border crossing issues with some of the hospitals. So I wouldn't necessarily conclude that Prince George's has a low readmission rate.
I think my point here is that Garrett, Union of Cecil, Easton, they're relatively small hospitals. They've got relatively low readmission rates. Those rates might be a little volatile. So I wanted to highlight the idea of we do need to come back to this and look to see if there is that pattern.
So we are going to be looking at the Medicare. We are going to focus on the Medicare hospital-wide readmission so that we take into account the border issues a little bit, and comparing to the national rate, only 2 hospitals in the state are better than the national average, right, Allison? Right. So I mean, that speaks to the skew distribution that we are observing here. And at the same time, again, we are talking about the improvement, and in that sense, what is that base? We discussed how far you can lower the readmission rate to. So Garrett has 7.6 base. So then looking at their rate, and compare it to the so first look at the Medicare rate, what that is compared to the distribution, and then if it is still low, is that reasonable? Is that the bottom that you think that there is no improvement that could be achieved from the 8% readmission rate? It's from the PPR, the potentially preventable readmission work that we did, which is trying to get at that, which ones are preventable, which ones are expected. I believe those rates were around 3%, 3 to 4% range. I can go back and try to pull those in too. It's a completely different way of looking at it, but at the same time, it kind of gives us a sense of what is that bottom line is. The PPR, remember we had the PPR preventable way back. So the difference between what they measured, so they measure back then, if I remember, or average readmission, potentially preventable readmission rate was 8, and all-cause, all DRG is around 12. So the difference, I take it as unpreventable. So that's kind of the way we had looked at it.
So does that imply that you could improve 4%, or does that imply you could get to 8%? I'm not completely following you.
I'm sorry. So what I'm seeing is on the non-payroll DRG, we know some of them are not preventable.
Yeah.
When you look at the preventable readmission rate, it is at 8%. All payer is 12, and then PPR said it's at 8%. So I said the difference is probably if you prevented all the potentially avoidable readmissions, you're still going to have 4% readmission rate in our measure. It's a jump leap, but in terms of the way I'm looking at it, you know, the number is around 5 or.
So I guess I want to get back to the point. If you start saying we can't reduce readmissions in rich areas of the state, which are no, but I'm going to say that. So we can't reduce readmissions in rich areas of the state. Then, in order to make our avoidable utilization go down fast enough, that would mean that we would have to put all the targets on the poor areas of the state, and that we would have to expect all the avoidable utilization to come from there. And I'm pretty sure when you put our use rates, and I actually know, when you put our use rates per 1,000 for the vast majority of the areas of the state of Maryland, that you're going to find that there's plenty of avoidable utilization everywhere, and we need to make sure that we don't start zeroing in to excuse one area of the state from participating in the avoidable utilization reductions that we need to make in the state. And so, and especially in the rural areas of the state whose are so dependent on the Medicare program that we have to keep their economic stability as it is. I just want to make sure that we don't go down a path of trying to think ways up to not have everybody participating in reducing avoidable utilization. I just want to put that out there up front because it'll be a problem for reaching the targets that we need to reach. And I know that it's always easy to start thinking up reasons why somebody can't make their numbers, but if we don't get the utilization down that 2.5%, then we're not going to hit the numbers that we need to hit to make the rate model work. And so I just want to put that out there. And it is the rural areas, the who are very dependent on the model, the suburban areas who are also very dependent on the model. Everybody in the state is very dependent on the model, and we can't. We need to make sure that everybody is participating in reducing avoidable utilization. So I just want to say that, because I know we start going off on paths a lot of trying to rethink how to stir the pot.
On that note, thank you for coming. Happy holidays. And then we'll pick up the remaining issues in January. Yeah. Kim, do you have it? I think it's on the
January 1st.
No, it's not January 3rd.
Let's see who's going to get it first.
January the 20th, Wednesday, January 20th at 9:30.
All right.